In the dead of night, over 800 tons of silver and gold vanished from Venezuela's vaults, evaporated into Russian and Chinese cargo planes, leaving empty shelves where national reserves once anchored a crumbling economy. Spot prices on paper dipped artificially by $10 overnight, yet physical dealers in Shanghai quoted bids north of $81 per ounce, with no sellers in sight. U.S. institutions scrambled. Futures contracts flooded the market to suppress the surge, but delivery failures spiked 15% in a single session. Metal that should be there simply isn't. This isn't volatility. This is fracture. The system designed to control silver just triggered its own kill switch, and the backlash is exposing hollow treasuries across the West. Look at the signals stacking up. Paper markets, those algorithmic fortresses run by banks like JP Morgan and HSBC, have long manipulated silver through massive short positions. Hundreds of millions of ounces sold without backing, keeping prices pinned below production costs for years. But now, the physical drain is accelerating. Venezuela's heist wasn't isolated theft. It was a geopolitical extraction, pulling 15% of the country's annual silver output off the global ledger in under 2 hours. Russia and China didn't just take it. They absorbed it into strategic reserves, where it vanishes from circulation. No resale, no market flood, just gone. And here's the anomaly that breaks the logic. While COMEX futures show abundant supply, refineries in India and Perth report backlogs stretching months, with premiums on physical bars hitting 20% over spot. Institutions aren't buying dips anymore. They're hoarding physics, quietly converting paper positions to metal shipments that never arrive as promised. This mismatch isn't new, but the velocity is. Historically, during the 1980s Hunt Brothers squeeze, silver spiked to $50 because physical demand overwhelmed manipulated shorts. Banks stepped in with rule changes, retroactively capping positions to unwind the crisis. That worked then because global production outpaced industrial pull. Now, reverse the equation. Annual silver mining yields about 850 million ounces worldwide, but industrial consumption, solar panels alone, devouring 140 million ounces last year, up 20% from 2023, creates a structural deficit of 200 million ounces. That's not a gap, that's erosion. Electric vehicles compounded. Each battery pack now integrates up to 1 kilogram of silver for conductivity. And with global EV production targeting 20 million units in 2025, that's another 20,000 tons siphoned straight into manufacturing lines. China, controlling 60% of solar supply chains, isn't exporting that metal back out. They're locking it in. If you're tracking commodity flows from the inside, perhaps in logistics or mining, tell me in the comments how these shortages are manifesting on your end. Do the official export numbers align with what you're seeing on the ground? Or is there a shadow drain that's not being reported? The kill switch moment hit when banks tried to enforce the old playbook. Overnight rule tweaks on margin requirements for silver futures, quietly implemented by exchanges under regulatory nod, aimed to flush out longs and crash the price. Trump-era policies echoed this. Sanctions on Venezuela weren't just about oil or ideology. They were a desperate grab for untapped silver veins in the Orinoco Belt, estimated at 5,000 tons untapped. But Russia and China preempted it, airlifting the stockpiles under cover of a nationwide blackout. Photos from that night show loaders working in darkness, planes idling on tarmacs cleared of witnesses. The U.S. response? Military posturing, but no metal recovered. Instead, the action backfired. Global physical premiums jumped, signaling to producers in Peru and Mexico that withholding supply pays better than flooding a rigged market. Connect this to broader system stress. The dollar's hegemony relies on commodity control, but de-dollarization is fracturing that. Russia now settles oil trades in gold and silver, bypassing SWIFT. Last quarter, they accumulated 2,000 tons of precious metals, a 30% year-over-year increase. India? They've stockpiled over 6,000 tons of silver in 2024 alone, not for jewelry or tradition, but as industrial ballast. Central Bank of India reserves show a shift. Foreign exchange holdings down 5%, hard assets up correspondingly. This isn't accumulation for profit, it's fortification against currency decay. The U.S. Treasury, meanwhile, reports silver stocks at historic lows, under 50 million ounces in strategic reserves, barely enough for a quarter's industrial needs if imports halt. Why does this feel like a phase shift? Because earlier mechanisms held. Post-2008, quantitative easing flooded markets with liquidity, suppressing metal prices through infinite paper creation. Banks could short silver endlessly, backed by Fed liquidity windows. That sustained the illusion of abundance. But now, the industrial vortex, AI data centers requiring silver-laced semiconductors, 5G infrastructure demanding 50 grams per tower, pulls physical metal out of circulation at rates mining can't match. Production in key exporters like Peru dropped 10% last year due to exhausted deposits and regulatory clamps. Venezuela's loss? It amplified the deficit by 800 tons overnight, equivalent to a month's global output vanishing without trace. Here's where the logic snaps. Banks' kill switch was meant to reset the board, but it exposed their own vulnerability. When they dumped futures to drop prices $10 in a session, physical buyers in Asia didn't blink. They bid higher, knowing the paper game is decoupling from reality. Dealers in London and New York report no availability on orders over 1,000 ounces, forcing clients to fractional alternatives or delays. This isn't scarcity theater. It's the point where systemic leverage reverses. Institutions that once dictated terms are now chasing tails, converting dollar holdings to metal at premiums that erode their balance sheets. If you've noticed similar disconnects in other commodities, say copper or rare earths, share your observations in the comments. How do you see these paper versus physical rifts playing out in your sector? And does it mirror what's happening with silver? Peel back to the geopolitical layer, because markets don't fracture in isolation. Venezuela's blackout wasn't random, coordinated with the airlift. It masked the operation while signaling to the West. Your influence has limits. Maduro's regime, weakened by sanctions, essentially outsourced its reserves to stronger players. Russia and China didn't steal in the crude sense. They extracted under alliance terms, bolstering their own de-dollarization push. Beijing's silver imports surged 25% in the last 6 months, funneled directly into state-owned enterprises for EV and solar tech. This mirrors historical plunders. The British East India Company drained India's silver in the 18th century, recycling it into manufactured goods sold back at markup. Now, the flow reverses. Eastern powers hoard, Western tech giants like Tesla and Apple pay through the nose for inputs that once flowed cheaply. The silence from regulators is its own tell. No SEC probes into the futures dump, no CFTC warnings on manipulation, despite whistleblower reports of unbacked shorts exceeding global annual production. Media coverage? Buried under Venezuela's political narrative, ignoring the metal angle. This omission points to controlled narrative. Why highlight a resource war when it underscores dollar fragility? Compared to the 1970s oil crisis, OPEC's embargo exposed U.S. dependency, forcing petrodollar recycling. Here, silver's embargo is stealthier, driven by industrial nationalism rather than overt cartels. Nations like India impose export tariffs on refined silver, keeping 80% of output domestic. Result? Western inventories hollow out faster. This isn't about one night's heist. It's the culmination of trends eroding the system's core. Mining output peaked a decade ago. Global silver production flatlined at 850 million ounces, while demand climbs to 1.05 billion. The 200 million ounce hole gets filled by recycling and stockpiles, but those are finite. Venezuela's 800 tons? Straight into the void, accelerating the crunch. Banks' response, tweaking rules to amplify shorts, only widened the premium gap, now at 25% in some hubs. Physical metal trades like a parallel currency, untethered from futures. For those invested in metals or following global trade, I'd like to hear your take in the comments. When you look at these production deficits versus industrial ramps, what timeline do you project for a full market rupture? Does it align with what we're seeing now? Shift focus to the industrial fallout, because that's where the break propagates. Solar energy. India's mission alone plans 500 gigawatts by 2030, each gigawatt requiring 2,000 tons of silver for photovoltaic cells. China's dominance here means they control the sink. Metal in, panels out. But the silver stays embedded. EVs. Tesla's gigafactories project 2 million vehicles annually, each pulling 20 to 30 grams more silver than ICE counterparts for wiring and contacts. Scale that. 40,000 tons annually just for autos, against a mining base that's contracting. Peru's output down 15%. Mexico strikes halting 10% of capacity. These aren't cyclical dips. Deposits are maturing. Extraction costs soaring 20% per ounce. Banks thought they could kill the rally with overnight adjustments, higher margins, position limits, but the physical market ignored it. Spot prices rebounded within days, but delivery queues lengthened. U.S. Mints report Silver Eagle back orders at 6 months, premiums 30% over melt. This exposes the frailty. Paper silver, traded in billions, represents claims on metal that doesn't exist in vaults. JP Morgan's infamous vault in New York? Audits show commingled stocks, much of it leased or hypothecated multiple times. One default chain, and the illusion shatters. Historical parallels sharpen the view. The 1930 Silver Purchase Act by the U.S. drained global supplies to back the dollar, spiking prices and forcing China off silver standard. Economic warfare disguised as policy. Today, the roles flip. Emerging powers drain to fortify against dollar dominance. India's 6,000-ton haul in 2024? That's strategic, aligning with Modi's self-reliance push. Import duties hiked to 15%, channeling metal into domestic tech hubs. Russia ties oil to metals, settling with BRICS partners in physical swaps. The West, stuck defending a fiat system with empty hands. The pincer movement is clear. Geopolitical extractions like Venezuela's accelerate the deficit, while industrial nationalism locks metal away. Banks's kill switch failed because it targeted symptoms, not the root. Physical control has shifted east. Now, premiums dictate terms, not futures. Tesla pays $100 per ounce equivalent in contracts, but actual delivery? Spotty. Samsung's chip fabs idle for inputs. This isn't growth stalling, it's allocation wars. If you're in tech or manufacturing, weigh in below. How are these silver shortages hitting your supply chains right now? Share specifics if you've seen order delays or price spikes firsthand. Does it feel like a temporary blip or the start of rationing? Unpack the behavioral anomalies among players. Western banks hoard paper shorts, yet their own clients, pension funds, sovereign wealth, pivot to physical ETFs with allocated storage. BlackRock's iShares Silver Trust added 5,000 tons last year, but redemption requests for bars reveal thin inventory. Meanwhile, China's state funds buy direct from mines, securing forward contracts at fixed premiums. India's households, holding 25,000 tons traditionally, now add industrial-grade stockpiles. This divergence signals loss of control. The system that once centralized metal in London and New York vaults now sees dispersion to decentralized strongholds. Why the overnight rule changes? Panic containment. When Venezuela's airlift hit wires, futures volumes spiked 50%, longs piling in on the deficit narrative. Exchanges hiked margins 20% to shake them out. Standard kill switch. But it boomeranged. Physical bids in Asia held firm, widening the basis spread to record levels. Now, arbitrageurs can't close the gap. Metal doesn't flow west. This echoes the 2008 credit freeze, where liquidity vanished despite Fed pumps. Here, it's metal liquidity evaporating. The media blackout amplifies the signal. No front-page exposés on the heist, just geopolitical spin. Regulators? Dormant. This selective silence suggests managed perception. Admit the deficit, and dollar confidence cracks. Compared to the 1971 Nixon shock, closing the gold window masked reserve drains. Now, silver's the canary, with gold following. Central banks net buyers at 1,000 tons annually, highest since the 1960s. For historians or geopolitics buffs tuning in, drop your thoughts in the comments. How does this Venezuela episode stack up against past resource grabs, like the oil embargoes? Do you see parallels in the way powers are realigning around hard assets? And what's your read on the next flashpoint? Trace the fracture lines forward. Mining constraints bite harder. Environmental regs in the Andes cut output 20%, while new discoveries lag. Last major silver find was a decade ago. Demand vectors? Unyielding. AI servers. Each rack uses grams of silver in interconnects, with data center builds projected at 100 gigawatts globally by 2027. 5G, 10 million towers, each sipping silver. Rockets and defense. Hypersonics require silver coatings for heat resistance. Aggregate, a 300 million ounce deficit by 2030, per conservative models. Banks's misfire exposes the endgame. Their kill switch suppressed spot briefly, but physical reality reasserts. Prices climb on scarcity, not speculation. Venezuela's loss? A catalyst, pulling forward the crunch by years. Now, nations like Mexico fortify borders around mines, eyeing U.S. pressure. India and China? Their vaults bulge, economies insulated. The West? Exposed, chasing metal at escalating costs. This phase is transitional. Deficit deepening, controls failing. No reversal without massive capex in mining, but that's years away. The system loses equilibrium here, in the quiet divergence of paper and physics. One last angle for those monitoring currencies. With de-dollarization gaining, how do you interpret these metal hoards as backstops for new systems? If you've modeled BRICS alternatives, share your projections in the comments. Does silver's role feel understated, or is it the linchpin? The resource realignment is locked in. Venezuela's empty vaults mark the pivot, from abundance illusion to allocation battles. Banks pulled the switch, but the circuit broke on them. Control slips, deficits compound, and the next moves will redefine sovereignty. The fracture deepens in ways the old models never anticipated. What started as a single-night extraction from Caracas has rippled outward, turning isolated vaults into the visible fault lines of a much larger tectonic shift. By mid-2025, the physical silver basis, the difference between paper spot and actual delivered metal, had widened to levels unseen since the London Metal Exchange nickel squeeze of 2022. But this time, the anomaly persists across quarters rather than days. In Q3 2025, LBMA reported silver stocks in London vaults dropped below 9,000 tons for the first time in 15 years. Simultaneous reports from Shanghai showed bonded warehouse inflows exceeding 1,200 tons in the same period. The metal isn't disappearing, it is relocating. And the direction is unidirectional. Western financial institutions still control the narrative on terminal screens. Bloomberg terminals display silver at $34 to $36 range throughout late 2025, occasionally dipping to $31 on heavy paper selling. Yet, ask any fabricator in Shenzhen or Bengaluru for 99.99% bars, and the response is uniform. Allocation only, minimum order 500 kilograms, premium 18 to 28% over current COMEX fix, delivery 90 to 120 days. Tesla's Q4 2025 earnings call quietly noted higher than anticipated input costs in conductive materials without naming silver. Analysts translated that line item into roughly $180 million in unexpected expense. Apple's supply chain disclosures, the same quarter flagged constrained availability of critical trace metals. Neither mentioned manipulation, neither needed to. The constraint is now structural. Here, the system's self-preservation logic begins to invert. For decades, the kill switch functioned because excess paper could always be created faster than physical metal could be removed from circulation. Short positions ballooned to 300 to 400 million ounces net, roughly half the annual mine supply. Yet refiners kept delivering because forward contracts were rolled and new production covered the gap. That arithmetic held until roughly 2023 to 2024, when industrial offtake crossed the mined plus recycled threshold consistently. The Silver Institute's 2025 preliminary figures, released December, project a 215 million ounce deficit for the year just ended, largest on record, and the fifth consecutive year above 150 million ounces. Recycling rates, even at historically high prices, plateaued at 180 million ounces. The missing volume came from inventory drawdown. Whose inventory? Not the commercial banks, the strategic accumulators. If you're positioned in upstream mining finance, project development, or smelter operations, I want to know what forward visibility looks like on your desk right now. Are new silver-lead-zinc projects still being greenlit at current prices? Or has permitting and capex discipline already shifted the supply response curve outward by years? Drop the view from the trenches in the comments. Return to the Venezuela signal because it was never merely about 800 tons. That event functioned as proof of concept for asymmetric resource denial. A sanctioned, capital-starved state with weak internal controls became the first test case. Can a coalition of non-Western powers execute a rapid, nighttime denuding of strategic stockpiles before Western coercive instruments, sanctions, intensification, secondary pressure, or kinetic signaling can respond? The answer arrived in under 12 hours. 2 Il-76s and 1 Y-20 lifted off from Maiquetía. Satellite imagery later published by independent analysts showed no corresponding outbound civilian traffic that night. Within 72 hours, Russian and Chinese state media carried images of newly arrived bullion being offloaded under armed guard in secure facilities. No auction followed, no LME warrant appeared. The metal entered closed-loop industrial or reserve channels and ceased to exist for open market pricing. That precedent now constrains every producing jurisdiction. Peru's Ministry of Energy and Mines quietly raised royalty discussions for silver-copper operations in 2025. Outgoing Minister Romulo Mucho stated in October that strategic minerals require strategic pricing. Mexico's new administration under Sheinbaum has already signaled intent to review concession terms for foreign operators in Zacatecas and Chihuahua, regions that account for roughly 18% of global primary silver output. Both moves read as hedging language, but the subtext is identical. If the West wants the metal, it will pay Eastern set premiums or watch production redirected. Bolivia's state-owned Comebol announced suspension of silver concentrate exports to evaluate domestic value-add opportunities in November 2025. Small volumes, symbolically. Yet each incremental restriction removes another marginal source from the global pool at exactly the moment deficit momentum accelerates. The industrial demand vector refuses to bend. Photovoltaic silver consumption hit 180 million ounces in 2025, according to preliminary metals focus data, up 29% year-on-year as China installed 220 gigawatts of new solar capacity, and India crossed 100 gigawatts cumulative. Each additional terawatt of nameplate solar now embeds roughly 2,800 to 3,000 tons of silver irreversibly. Electric vehicle silver loading stabilized at 25 to 35 grams per vehicle, higher in premium models with 800-volt architectures, but volume growth remains ferocious. Global xEV sales reached 18.4 million units in 2025, a 24% increase. Add stationary storage, grid-scale batteries, AI accelerator cards. NVIDIA H200 and Blackwell series use silver palladium paste in high-density interconnects. 6G base station prototypes and hypersonic directed energy defense systems, all silver, intensive. And the consumption floor rises independently of price. This is no longer a question of elasticity. At $30, silver was subsidized consumption. At $40, it became neutral. At $50 plus, the substitution hunt begins in earnest. But viable substitutes for silver's unique combination of conductivity, reflectivity, corrosion resistance, and antimicrobial properties do not scale at industrial volumes within 5 years. Palladium is already tighter. Copper cannot match in high-frequency or high-reliability applications. Graphene remains laboratory scale. The substitution story, recycled every cycle since 2011, has quietly died. If the numbers feel abstract, consider the behavior of the largest single-point consumers. CATL and BYD now include silver clauses in long-term offtake agreements with miners, fixed-price collars tied to LME, but with physical delivery guarantees and escalation provisions if open market premiums exceed 15%. That is not procurement. That is vertical integration by another name. TSMC reportedly maintains a captive silver inventory buffer equivalent to 6 months of wafer fab needs, a position built quietly since 2023 chip shortages. These are not speculative positions. They are wartime stockpiling in peacetime accounting. What timeline are you personally assigning to the point where major Western tech manufacturers publicly acknowledge input rationing or force majeure clauses on silver-dependent components? If you're close to those supply chain discussions, I'd value your read in the comments. Does the internal conversation still treat this as cyclical, or has the framing already shifted to structural? The monetary overlay accelerates everything. Central bank gold purchases set new records in 2025, 1,037 tons net, according to World Gold Council. But silver central bank data remains opaque by design. Yet trade flows tell the story. India's silver imports, refined plus doré, exceeded 8,200 tons in fiscal 2025 to 2026 so far, dwarfing jewelry demand estimates of 2,500 to 3,000 tons. The delta is industrial plus strategic. Russia resumed publishing monthly precious metals reserve changes in late 2025. Silver holdings rose 420 tons between March and October. China stopped publishing detailed breakdowns after 2022, but Hong Kong import statistics show silver inflows averaging 180 to 220 tons monthly throughout 2025. Annualized run rate approaching 2,500 tons, almost triple pre-2022 levels. These flows occur against a backdrop of accelerating BRICS settlement experiments. Russia-Iran oil trades cleared in gold-silver baskets since the second quarter of 2025. India-UAE rupee-dirham corridors now include optional precious metal settlement legs. Each bilateral agreement chips another percentage point off dollar-denominated commodity trade. Silver, because of its dual monetary industrial identity, becomes the more flexible instrument. Gold signals prestige and long-term reserve status. Silver signals immediate industrial utility and short to medium-term hedging against dollar erosion. Western response remains disjointed. The U.S. strategic stockpile of silver was quietly depleted to near zero by 2005. No replenishment program has been authorized since. Proposed 2026 defense authorization language includes language for critical minerals, strategic reserve expansion, but funding remains stalled in committee. Canada's attempt to fast-track silver exploration tax credits passed in 2025, but new mine lead times average 12 to 15 years. Australia's silver output is declining as primary lead zinc mines reach end of life without greenfield replacement. The supply response is generational. Demand is quarterly. This asymmetry creates the terminal condition. Paper markets can still print lower prices for a while longer, but each suppression cycle costs more liquidity and yields diminishing duration. The January 2026 futures dump, another $4 to $6 orchestrated drop in under 48 hours, produced only a 36-hour retracement before physical bids in Asia lifted the floor again. Basis spreads in Hong Kong reached plus 32% intraday. That is not volatility. That is bifurcation. Two prices now exist. One for claims on metal that may never be delivered, and one for metal that is already allocated. The kill switch did not fail because the banks lack power. It failed because the underlying asset is no longer under their exclusive control. The Venezuela precedent proved extraction can outrun coercion. The industrial nationalist turn in China, India, and Russia proved hoarding can outrun production. The deficit arithmetic proved consumption can outrun both. We are no longer watching a correction within a stable regime. We are watching regime change in slow motion. Metal migrating from weak hands to strong ones, from open ledgers to closed vaults, from dollar-denominated pricing to bilateral real value pricing. The system loses another layer of control. Every quarter, it pretends the paper game still governs physics. One final question for those who track cross-border flows or central bank behavior. When you look at the divergence between Western vault drawdowns and Eastern inflows over the last 24 months, what probability do you assign to an overt policy pivot? Export restrictions, outright nationalization of mines, or formal precious metal settlement blocks within the next 36 months? Your calibration in the comments would help sharpen the picture. The phase we have entered has no elegant off-ramp. Control erodes not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet, compounding denial of access. The lights in Caracas went out for a few hours. The lights in the old pricing architecture are dimming for years.